Thank you, girls. I think that was their first time as worship leaders in the church, was it? Second time. Yeah, nice to have you with us, and I appreciate all your work beforehand. It's nice to see you all here this morning. How many people read Matthew 24 this week? So this side is pretty good, but this side needs some work, hey? Yeah, excellent. I believe you're going to get a greater blessing out of Matthew 24 if you actually pre-read beforehand. It's a very deep chapter, and we're going to study some deep things in it today. And I pray that you will grow from this like I have this week. We have some interesting things. We're fast coming to the end of the year, and I just want to tell you about a couple of things. If you read your email, you might have found out about them. We have a Revelation series happening next year in church during the service time, and this is something that we want you to invite your friends to. Today we're living in a very uncertain world with a lot of things happening, and the Bible has given us some clear direction about what is happening. And it gives us some clear understanding, and I believe that more than ever we should be looking at and studying these books, the books of Daniel and Revelation. And I believe that we're going to get a huge blessing out of it if we do that. Also, some other things that are happening next year that I want you to think about is that I've got a number of members that have actually come to me and said, look, people are asking me questions about this and about that. How do I best answer them? So we're actually going to do a Bible study class that helps you to help others. We've got some really good resources that are a part of that. Which we'll give out, and we have some really nice Bibles that will be available to those who would like to purchase them, a journaling type Bible. So keep that in mind. That'll happen, I think, in the first Tuesday of the week of February. Also, one other thing that you might not know about is that I've been talking to David Hapt, and I've been trying to get him to come and do another marriage counselling session with us. And this is not if you've just got problems within your marriage. This is actually something that will help to enhance your marriage as well. That's going to happen over the first weekend of February. So keep that date in mind, because we'd love you to be a part of that and to grow your relationships together with each other, but also to grow your relationships with God. So just a couple of things that I want you to keep in mind for next year. It's going to be an exciting year. I'm hoping it's going to be the last year that we're on this earth together, but I'm not so sure about that. But it'll be a time that we can grow closer together with each other and closer together with God. But today we're going to look at Matthew 24. Today we're going to look at the proof signs of two events. Two events in Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is dealing with the last week of Jesus' life here on this earth, which started in Matthew chapter 1, where Jesus made that triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And one of the first things that he did is that he entered the temple. And a number of things that you see happen after this happen in the temple. We find Jesus' authority was questioned in the temple. We find a number of things happen in the temple, and Matthew 24 begins with Jesus leaving the temple for the last time. And that's going to be really significant, so I want you to keep your minds around that. You know, my study on Matthew 24 over the last couple of weeks has made me reveal that this is a much deeper chapter than I gave it credit for. So we're going to have a look at some deep things, and we're going to need you to be paying attention and being on board, and hopefully you'll gain a blessing out of it like I have also. So, let's have a look. Now, I want to start where Jared left off the other week. I want to thank you for your service, Jared. That was excellent. And Lindy touched on a couple of things after that on deception. Now, if you haven't heard any of those two sermons, I suggest you get onto YouTube and listen to them, because they were very, very good. But I want to start where Jared left off, and that's in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 37. So open up your Bibles with me. Matthew 23 and verse 37. Matthew 23, verse 37. And it begins with, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who sent to her. How often I've wanted to gather her children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, for I say to you, you shall not see me no more till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And in the first verse of Matthew 24, we find Jesus departing the temple for the very last time. I want to show you something that happens here. How did we start? Jerusalem, Jerusalem. You know, when you hear that saying where the name is mentioned twice, it shows real significance in the Bible. We find that this happens only once according to Jerusalem. We find it also happens only once according to Abraham. We find it happens once according to Moses. We find it happens once according to Samuel. When we find it happening once according to Simon. And we find in the Bible that it happens 3 times for Saul, but both 3 times was just Saul retelling his version of the events. So here in the Bible we see Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Just like we saw in the Old Testament, Abraham, Abraham. When we look at those events and we see what happened, it was an actual turning point in the person's life. When Abraham was called and God called his name twice, what was Abraham about to do? He was about to slay his son. And he had to stop from doing that and focus on something else, and that was the ram in the thicket. The ram was going to take the place of his son. This was a new direction, a new thing for Abraham, and his name is called twice in this instance. We find that Jacob is only called twice, and that was when he was called to go into Egypt. We find that Moses was called twice, and this is after he had left Egypt and he was 40 years out in the wilderness caring for his father-in-law's sheep. And Jesus spoke to him through the burning bush, and he called him twice, Moses, Moses. Moses, I want you to take a new direction. Moses, I want to change from what you are doing and go in a different path. We find Samuel when he was called. He thought Eli was calling him. And 3 times he went to Eli, and then Eli realised, hey, God's talking to him. And then the next time God calls, he says, Samuel, Samuel. Samuel, Samuel, I've got a special job for you. I want you to change the direction in which you are going and go in a different direction. So here when we find that Jesus calls the Jerusalem twice, it has significant direction. It has significant meaning. And what it's actually saying is there's a change happening for Jerusalem. And the reason I mention that is because we're going to see something significant after this that tells us that Israel as a nation were no longer God's people. That the temple, the earthly temple, was no longer had the significance that it once had. There is a change happening for Jerusalem, and it's got a lot to do with Jesus here leaving the temple. And I want to suggest to you today that the temple was actually leaving the temple. You know, when we have a look at our study in Revelation next year, we're going to see that Jesus is described as the one who is the temple. Every aspect of Jesus, from his head to his feet, is described as an aspect of the temple, which is his ministry on our behalf to save us from our sinfulness. So here we have the temple leaving the temple. And notice what the disciples focus on in Matthew 24. Matthew 24 and verse 1, it says, Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And the disciples came to show him the building and the temple. In other words, they were looking at Jesus. They could see that he was upset. They could see that he was dismayed at his people who had rejected him time and time again. We saw it in the parables from 21 to 22, where Jesus told them of themselves and their condition. And Jesus is now mourning that, and he's very upset as he's leaving the temple for the last time because they didn't recognise what the temple pointed to. They didn't recognise what the temple pointed to. And so as Jesus was leaving in this depressed state, his disciples wanted to cheer him up. It's like they were trying to say, well, look at this temple. Look at this amazing temple. And it was an amazing temple. The stones, some of those stones that built the temple were like 4 ton each. And they're drawing his attention to it. Look at the beauty. Look, cheer yourself up a bit. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another, but will all be thrown down." You're looking at the temple as if that's the all-important thing. You've missed it. You're doing exactly what the Pharisees did. Do you not see these things? Don't focus on these things. That's not what the temple was meant to focus on. It was meant to be upon Jesus and what he was just about to do for them. But the disciples weren't getting it either. Look at the temple, look how beautiful it is. And he says it's going to be destroyed. And in verse 3 he says, "Now when he came to the Mount of Olives, the disciples said to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of your age?'" They came to him privately. They waited until they had their chance to see him privately. They couldn't talk about those things in front of other people. That would be like heresy to think that the temple was going to be destroyed again. Their focus was all wrong. In Christian groups today, I want to tell you that their focus is often not correct. We're going to see that there's 3 main deceptions. In this passage it tells us 3 times, be careful that you're not deceived, be careful that you're not deceived, be careful that you're not deceived. One of the 3 main deceptions in Christianity today is that the temple must be rebuilt. How many people know about that deceptive prophecy? A few of you? Yeah. A number of people are waiting for Israel to be able to rebuild their temple. That's why Donald Trump wanted to shift his embassy from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem, recognising that that was Israeli land. It is their place, and the sooner that could happen, the sooner they could rebuild the temple, they think that's the sign of when Jesus will come. But here it's telling us the temple was to be destroyed. Another one, a deception for people today, is that there is a secret rapture. There is a secret rapture that all of a sudden we're sitting in here and Troy just disappears. Ken goes. We better pick on some, Nikita's just disappeared. Joy's left there. What's happening? Some people are just silently raptured away and some people are left. Matthew 24 deals with this as well. And one of the other deceptive things is the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, where we have a 70-week prophecy. In Daniel chapter 9 we have a 70-week prophecy that is broken up into 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and then the last week. What many Christians today do is they separate that last week off and they put it off in the distant future. Matthew 24 is going to answer that as well. And that's why I say there's a lot in Matthew 24, and I basically want to skim over the outside, but I want us to get a picture of what is really important for you and I today. I want to get a picture of what was important for them living back then, but I want to get a picture of what is important for you and I today. Because what is important for you and I today is often not what we think. I hear people today saying that, look at the events. Look at this coronavirus. I believe it's this, and I believe that this is going to happen through this happening and this happening. And the Lord's coming. You better get ready. Man, you guys are dead. Didn't you not just hear what I said? you better get ready because the events are happening all over the place. And we use these things to actually get people to try and get ready. But I want to tell you that is not something that will last. That is not something that will last. The key to understanding Matthew 24, I believe, is found in verse 3. So let's take a closer look at verse 3. Actually, before we do, let's have a look at verses 6 to 8. Verses 6 to 8 says, "You will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of..." Anyone got anything different to sorrows? Sorry, Ken? Childhood. That's interesting. Childbirth. Thank you. Childbirth. Can't hear you through that mask. All these are the beginning of birth pains, some versions say. And certainly here the beginning of sorrows. How do we understand that? Well, let's have a look at verse 3 to try and get us to understand that a little bit more. Let's go back to verse 3. Verse 3 tells us, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, said, 'Tell us, when will these things be?'" Now what's these things? Call it out. What's these things? The destruction of the temple. Because remember that, when will these things be? Jesus has just told them that not one stone will be left upon another. When I say these things, if I was going to say these flowers, pointing into the flowers that are close to me, what would I say to those flowers out there? Would I say these flowers that are out in the foyer? What would I say? Those. So these things and those things. And here it says in verse 3, it says, "When will these things be, the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of your coming?" Now the word for coming here is your appearing, your parousia, your coming in all your glory. What will be the sign of that? And of the end of the age. Of the end of the age. End of the age. Now, something that opened up my understanding to Matthew 24, sadly, is missed out in the English language. Sadly, sometimes we don't have the exact word for the Greek word in our language. So we just use what is closest to us. When it says the end of the age, it's saying the centelia. Centelia. That's the Greek word. What does centelia mean? Because centelia is only mentioned here once. The other end is telos. Telos. Centelia is the complete end. If I say to you that this is the centelia of my sermon, that would mean I'm retiring after today and there's no more sermons left, because that's the end. That's the last one. That's the complete finish. The centelia is the end. And here in verse 3 it says, "What is the signs of your appearing and of the centelia?" The complete end. The complete end. So here, when we find end, we find in verse 6, "But the end is not yet." This end is telos. This end means the end of an event, but not the end. Is everyone on board with what I'm saying? Excellent. So there's two types of end. One is the end of the age, and one is the end of an event. End of an event. If I was going to say this would be the end of the sermon, I would use telos, because I'm going to preach again after this, Lord willing. So then it says later on in verse 13, "He who endures to the end will be saved." What kind of end is that? That's the end of the event. So here we find that this section is just talking about Jerusalem. This is just talking about the events that's going to happen before Jerusalem is destroyed. Now, I'm going to get a few people upset about this, because how many times have you heard before where people say wars, rumours of wars, famines, earthquakes, look how often they're happening, the end is near. Thinking about the total end. How many people have heard those sermons? I preached those sermons myself. Am I wrong in preaching those sermons? No, I'm not. Because there's a thing called typology, which means there's an event that happens here that is a forward to a greater event later on, and we'll look at that as well. But I want to show you that Matthew 24 is actually broken up into a number of sections. I call it 3 sections, some people call it 2 sections. But we find A, B, C, and then AC. Okay? Let's have a look how that is done. Matthew 24. We've already looked at this first section from 4. And it says in verse 8, all these things are the beginning of sorrows. These things are the beginning of sorrows. You know, I saw in the New Living Translation, and that's not really a translation I really like, but I see that was actually the best translation for this verse. Because it says, these are the beginning of the birth pains, with more to come later. In other words, what Jesus is doing here, that he is starting with this event, with the destruction of Jerusalem, and showing the events that are going to happen before the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's actually taking us right through until the appearing, the coming, the parousia. So we find here from verse 4, Jesus talks about these things. These things are the beginning of sorrows. And then it goes on to verse 15, and it says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Where is Jesus quoting from? Which verse in particular? Daniel 9 and verse 27. Daniel 9 and verse 27 has to do with the last week of Jesus' ministry. We find in the middle of the week he is to be cut off, and then we find that on a wing and a prayer, and then desolation will come upon Jerusalem. When was Jerusalem destroyed? 70 AD. So here we're telling the events before the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's saying there, then let those who were in Judea flee to the mountains. Why were they to flee to the mountains? So they didn't lose their lives. Because the temple was going to be destroyed. And the focus was for them was to get out of that region, to get out of the temple, and there wouldn't even be time for them to go back and get their clothes. And it also tells us, pray that your flight will not be on the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is still important back in those days in 70 AD. But we find that Christians who believe that, they saw the events that were happening, they saw that it was near, and they saw the desolation that was happening in Jerusalem. And they fled from that area, and they preserved their lives. It also tells us that last week of Daniel's prophecy applies to that period of time in 70 AD. It appeared to the final week of Jesus' earth here on this life, and it also applied to the destruction of Jerusalem. You can't cut that week off and put it somewhere in the distant future, because it is a fulfilled prophecy. It is part of the 70 weeks as a whole. Then it tells us in verse 21, For then there will be a great tribulation. When's this come after, this great tribulation? It comes after the fleeing of Jerusalem. Here is a new section from here, and it goes all the way down to verse 31. Here it talks about this great tribulation, and it tells us in verse 22, unless those days, now we're talking about future, not these days, but those days, and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days were shortened. In a book, The Desire of Ages, Ellen White writes about this tribulation as being the time of the dark ages. This is the period where millions of Christians lost their lives because of the deception of the church and not being able to stand on the church's side. The smallest estimation of people that died through that period of time was 30 million. The largest is 150 million people. So somewhere in between that amount is a massive amount of people that lost their lives because they chose to stand true for what God had asked for. I want us to look at verse 32. Actually, verse 27. Verse 27 talks about the Great Tribulation, and it goes through to verse 27 where it says, as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even unto the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And then 29 tells us, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven. This is events that are talked about in May 19, 1780 and November 12, 1833, where these events first took place. Revelation talks about some similar events, and I believe that we might see these events again in a greater aspect than what we did in those days. But that was the ending of the Great Tribulation that took place. But then we see the Son of Man coming. So the disciples are asking two questions. When will the destruction happen? And what will be the sign of your appearing? They probably thought that they were asking one question. But Jesus takes us through, and we get in verse 40 to verse 20, verse 4 to verse 20, relating to the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 21 to 28, relating to the great tribulation of the dark ages before the appearing of Jesus. And Matthew 24, 29 to 31, relating to the time just before the appearing of Jesus. Then in A, Matthew 24, 32 to 35, let's notice what happens then. 32 says, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you will know that summer is near. So also when you see these things. What's he talking about? The things that are close. Here he's come back to transition about the things that were to happen before the destruction of Jerusalem. When the fig tree, did the disciples know what he meant by the fig tree? Yes. As Jesus came into that temple, what did he do? He cursed the fig tree. And when he came out, the fig tree had died, and the disciples going, what's going on? And Jesus reveals to them what was going on. What they didn't really get, though, is that the nation of Israel was described as the fig tree. What they didn't get was all the parables leading up to this event was that. So he says, learn the lesson from the fig tree. When its branches has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things, that's the close things, know that is near, even at the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till you see all these things take place. All these close things. You know, people question this verse. There's people that question this verse and say the Bible's not accurate because Jesus hasn't come and the generation that was back then passed away. But when we look at this section, we find that this section is specifically talking to the destruction of Jerusalem. When they said a statement like, this generation will not pass, they gave that generation 40 years. When was Jesus saying this? In AD 31. And in 70 AD, that generation hadn't passed before they saw all these things take place. So when we look at it in a correct way, we see that now we're gone back to the events before the destruction of Jerusalem. All these things, when you see these things, this generation will not pass. That also is a fulfilled prophecy. This should actually give us confidence to know that the Bible is correct, that the Bible can be relied on, that the Bible is trustworthy, not to try and throw the Bible out. Notice what happens when we get to verse 36. But of what? But of, what's the next word? That day. Not this day, that day. Not this person, that person. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only. Did Jesus know when he was going to come back? Not in humanity. He knows now, but then when he said that, he does not know. And the only reason he was able to give this information to his disciples was because of his understanding of the Scriptures. You know, we have all these amazing Scriptures, we have all these amazing prophecies that tell us of the future, which tell us of the things that we can expect to happen. And because of our lackluster way that we study the Word, we miss it. We miss it like the Pharisees missed it. We miss it like the disciples missed it. But of that day and hour, not even the angels in heaven know, only the Father. And here we get to this third deception, this secret rapture. Where do we get it from? We get it from verse 40 and 41. It says, then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding in the mill, one will be taken and the other left. We got anyone missing yet? This event hasn't taken place yet, has it? What people say about this event, that it's going to be silent and secret, and all of a sudden we're just going to be working in the field or working at the mill or whatever, and all of a sudden people are going to disappear. It's also related to that series of books that were put out and movies were put out on the Left Behind series. Talks about 2 people flying in the plane and the pilot all of a sudden just disappears. And the co-pilot's got to steer the plane safely to shore or to land. Is that what this is saying? Let's go back. Verse 37 tells us, but as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So in other words, it's going to be as of the days of Noah. Now what was happening in Noah's day? It tells us, for as in the days before the flood, they were doing what? Eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. In other words, all the normal activities were continuing to go on, and they were unaware of what was just about to happen. And then in verse 39 it says, and did not know it until the flood came and did what? Took them all away. Who did it take away? The wicked. Where did it take them? To their destruction. So here it says, as in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Who was left behind in the days of Noah? The people in the ark. Yeah. So when we read now what comes next, what do we say? 2 will be working in the field, 1 will be taken, 1 will be left. Who's the one taken? The wicked. Thank you, Neville. The wicked are the ones taken. The ones that are left are the ones that are left to meet the Lord coming in the air. They're taken to their destruction because it's the same as in the days of Noah. And then we find what we are meant to be focusing on. And the rest of the passage right through until 26 verses 1 and 2 is all related to the second coming of Jesus. The second coming of Jesus. Now we know, like we said before, there were signs before the destruction of Jerusalem. There was false prophets and false Christs. There are also false prophets and false Christs today. How do we understand that all? We understand it as in verse 8. What did it say? They're the beginning of birth pains with more to come. It's going to continue to come like that, how it was back then, until the coming of the Lord. And as we know birth pains, we know that it's going to get closer and closer together and with greater and greater intensity. But what I believe that God is telling us is that this should not be our focus. This should not be our focus. We have the typology right throughout the Bible that we know that this means an event later on. And I'm not going to go through all those things, but we have Adam as a type of Christ. We have Abraham and Isaac, the sacrifice on the hill is a type of Jesus, and we'll go through all those things. But I want to look at what Jesus is saying to us today and why these two events were separated in this form. I believe that these events were separated to show both groups what their focus should be. For the people living back then, they were told to be careful of false Christs and false prophets. Make sure that you are not deceived. They were to focus on those events that were going to happen. When they saw those events, they knew it was to be near. And what were they then to focus on? That prophecy in Daniel, that last week prophecy of the 70-week prophecy. And they were also to prophesy that the gospel was to be preached in all the world before Jesus was to come. This gospel, Paul actually tells us in Colossians 1 verse 26, that the gospel had gone to the whole world. But we find that that is our focus also. What are we meant to focus on? Well, also that there will be false Christs and false prophets. We've already looked at 3 false prophecies in the Christian world today. The secret rapture, the cutting off the 1 week off, those other ones. But here, our focus should be, yes, that there will be deceptive prophecies. Yes, that there will be a great tribulation. And the great tribulation that's talked about here has already happened, so we know it's getting near. But our focus should be that it's going to be like the days of Noah. The world is going to continue on, marrying and giving in marriage and doing things. But the main focus, I believe, is in our key text today. Matthew 24, verses 42 to 44. Let's have a look. What does it say? Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour the Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is going to come at an hour you do not expect. The focus for us today is to do what? To watch. What does that word actually mean, to watch? To give strict attention to be cautious, to be active, to take heed lest through remission and indolence, laziness in other words, some destructive calamity suddenly will overtake you. One of the reasons we need to be ready is because we don't know when our life will end either. But we need to watch. But watch is more than just keeping an eye on things with your eyes. I mean, the disciples were told to do what? To watch and pray. They were in the dark when Jesus said that. So it didn't mean to just keep an eye out. It didn't mean to keep an eye out and watch out for the people that are going to come and take Jesus. That wasn't the word that he was wanting to use. The word that he was wanting to use is like the Greek word for this word, which tells us that we need to give strict attention to. We need to be cautious. We need to also be active. The word for watching is not sleeping. It's actually staying awake. Being connected, that's what will help with watching. Watching and praying. Watching and praying. You know, Ellen White said the shortness of time is frequently urged as an incentive for seeking righteousness and making Christ our friend. She says this should not be the great motive with us, for it savours of? Savours of? How does it savour of selfishness? It makes that event all about us. Keep living your life until you see those events. When you see those events, you better get ready because you don't want to miss out. Is that what the second coming is all about? The second coming is about connecting ourselves with our Saviour. If that's not something you're keen to do now, well, that's not something you're going to enjoy in heaven. I want to tell you that Christ is attractive in and of himself. He shouldn't need an event to get him to be attractive. He is already attractive. The focus from verse 44 onwards through 25, and I'm looking forward to your sermon next week, Isaac, on this. The focus is on that watching and the things that we need to do for that watching. Those who watch for the Lord's coming are waiting and not waiting in idle expectancy. It is to awaken them to the great sin of rejecting his offers of mercy. Those who are watching for the Lord are purifying their souls by obedience to the truth. They're being filled by the Holy Spirit, which is revealed in the virgins, the parable of the virgins. Watch to give strict attention to take heed lest some great event fall upon you and you miss out. You know, when I look back over history, I see that there were pandemics right throughout history. And the size of the circle represents the amount of people that died in that period of time. We see the plagues of Justinian killed 30 to 50 million people. The Black Death killed 75 to 200 million people. Smallpox, 25 to 55. All those other events right throughout history killed millions and millions of people. Now I know that coronavirus has killed 5 million people. But I want to ask you today, if that all dies down, and Christ doesn't come not long after that, what is going to happen with your experience if you've just connected with God so you don't miss out on heaven? This is really serious stuff. You know, there is so many deceptive about focusing on the event. I remember when a preacher came to Kingscliff probably around about 10 years ago, and he sort of predicted that the Lord would come in probably about 2 years' time. Now that was about 10 years ago. And guess what I saw to the people in Kingscliff that heard that message? They got on fire. They were going great. But 3 months after the event, guess what had happened? They went back to the things that they were normally doing. Because the event wasn't enough to change and reorder their life. A year or two later, another speaker came out from the US, and he talked about the importance of spending an hour a day with the Lord. Just 1 hour out of 24. An hour a day with the Lord. Guess what I saw to those people in Kingscliff? It changed and reordered their life, and it lasted. It lasted. Focusing on the events can be deceptive. It can promote selfishness. And when it's all over, it can enable us to fall back asleep. Focusing on the event can cause the coming of Jesus to come as a thief in the night and us not to be ready. Signs of the times won't save. Only Jesus can do that. You know, many of us were looking to this climate change conference, and we were hoping the Pope was going to go there and implement the Sunday law, because then we knew that we didn't have much time left. How many people were hoping that? Let's be honest. Well, apparently that came to an end yesterday, and that wasn't one of the 7 outcomes of that meeting. Is it going to rock your faith in God? I hope not. But it's interesting that the Pope didn't actually turn up, but he sent his delegates there, and he sent a message, and he said, "Time is running out. This occasion must not be wasted, lest we have the faith to face God's judgments for our failure to be faithful stewards of the world he has entrusted into our care." Sounds like a good message, doesn't it? But it's one that he is preparing, and we know that those events will come. But if we're spending all our time on the events and not on our Saviour, the second coming could come as a thief in the night. I want to tell you that Christ is attractive. Sadly, it took me 40 years to realise that, and I hope it doesn't take you that long to realise that. But Christ is attractive on his ways, on his own. His ways are perfect. His law is perfect. His character is perfect. And his love for you and I is perfect. His love for you and I is beyond belief. Gets me a little bit emotional just thinking about that. My call to you is today, as I think of Revelation 3, the message to the last day church, I want to tell you that Christ is knocking at the door of your hearts. And he's asking you to open the door and let him in. Stop spending all our time focusing on the events and start spending time with Jesus, because he does love you and he has a plan for you and he wants to be reunited with you. Signs of the times won't save, but Jesus will. Am I closing in prayer? I want to invite you to stand as we close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, I just want to thank you for Jesus. I want to thank you that he has a plan for each of our lives. I just pray, Lord, that each of us will continue to let him in, not just at this time, but daily, and spend daily time with you, so you can grow us to be ready for you when you come. It's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.